were talking about marriage, you kind of made a point that if you stay, which is of course a really good point, you have more probabilities to get to a solution, right?
Yeah.
But that is also like, if it's also assumed that you will always get to a solution.
Yes, true. Yes, and yes.
No, but a solution that will keep the marriage.
True. Well, you know, there used to be, before the divorce laws were really liberalized, you could sue for irreconcilable differences. And sometimes people do find themselves in that situation. It's like one person wants children and the other person doesn't. It's like, that's a tough one. It's a tough one to negotiate. So I'm certainly not saying that just because you lock yourself into like two cats in a barrel, that will make you solve your problems, because problems are hard to solve and sometimes you can't solve them. I was just pointing out what the cost of leaving the back door open is, and it's a big cost. And you know, one of the things I see too is that people's identities fragment increasingly across time. You know, one of the things that you have as you age is something like the continuity of your life. You know, you have someone that you're with, you've tied your story together with theirs, you have children, maybe they have children. It's like there's this continual payoff, so to speak, in quality that you obtain from staying within that frame. And you can jump out of that, and I suppose to some degree that provides freedom, but it isn't obvious to me that it does that for people.
But you're assuming that one specific relationship is high quality. It may not be.
No, but it's also the case that sequential relationships are unlikely to be that. So, look, I'm definitely not making a utopian case for marriage. So
I would like to hear the case for divorce from you, because it is really interesting, right? It's a strong point, but at the same time, I think there are relationships that are really low quality.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then insisting on them cannot be good.
yeah, well, that's definitely the alternative argument, and of course there are strong things to be said on both sides, but see, there's some additional problems with divorce that people don't really grasp when they're young. Like the idea that you can be divorced once you have children, that's kind of a stupid idea, because you can't. You can find a limited substitute for your initial freedom. But if you have kids and you try to get divorced, the probability that that's going to demolish your life is very, very high. First of all, it's incredibly expensive. So one or both of you is going to come out of that poor. And your market value has declined. Let's say you're the woman who takes the kids. Your market value has declined radically. You're going to be poorer. The man, he's just as screwed, because he is now an indentured servant and there's no escape from it. So it's not so bad if you can negotiate a peaceful separation, and some people can, but lots of times if you have a terrible relationship, it's not like negotiating a peaceful separation is all that easy. But if you're at each other's throats, good luck to you. I think it's roughly equivalent to having non-fatal cancer. It is not pleasant. It's a 10-year process, 15-year process. It'll cost you $250,000, and it'll tear a big chunk out of your life. And also it will really disrupt your relationship with your kids. And you know, you bring kids into a step-parent family, they do not do as well. Step-parents are not as good parents as biological parents, and the data on that is clear. Now, obviously there are exceptions, because there are terrible biological parents and there are wonderful step-parents. But if you look in aggregate, it's not that easy to care for children. You need everything you can binding you to them. And if they're someone else's children, mostly they get in the way of the person that you love, right? Well, let's say you have a child, I'll be right out. Let's say you have a child and I want to go out with you. every second you spend with that child is a second you don't spend with me. And there's going to be a price for that. I'm not going to be happy about that. And if I have a child, you're going to feel exactly the same way. You might say, well, no, I love children. It's like, yeah, sure you do. I doubt it. You might love your child. And you know, it's pretty specific the way that people love children. So, and the rate of abuse for kids in step-parent families is way higher than it is in biological families. There's not even any comparison. Known territory, or what's explored. Unknown territory, or what's not explored. The transformation or the dissolution of one into the other, and then the reconstitution of that. That's what an election does, right? It's like, okay, we have our leader, who's the person at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and defines the nature of this particular structure. There's an election. It's regulated chaos. No one knows what's going to happen. It's the death of the old king. Bang, we go into a chaotic state. Everyone argues for a while. And then out of that argument, they produce a consensus, and poof, we're in a new state. Right? That's the meta story, right? Order, chaos, order. But it's partial order, chaos, reconstituted and revivified order. That's the thing, is that this order is better than that order. So there's progress. And that's partly why I think the idea of moral relativism is wrong. There's progress in moral order. And it was defined properly by Piaget. The new moral order does everything the old moral order did, and some additional things. That's what constitutes progress. Now, here's a strange idea, and we'll talk about this more as we progress through the class. What's the ultimate in order? Well, it's not this, obviously, because it can collapse. And it's not this, because it can collapse. And so then you think, well, there's no ultimate order, even though there's progression. But then you have to move it up one level of abstraction. What's the ultimate order? Doing this. Willingness to do that. That's the ultimate order. Right? It's order at a different level of analysis, and you can see that's what's represented in that idea. That's what that idea means. That's the phoenix, right? The phoenix is something that lives, ages, and then allows itself to be consumed by fire, and then reemerges. And the old phoenix gets old and burns, and the new phoenix reemerges. And so the real phoenix is the thing that's constant across those transformations. That's the Jungian self. That's what he meant. The self is the element of the psyche that remains intact across transformations. Yeah, it's a bloody amazing idea. That's for sure. And you could think about that. That's why Jung claimed, for example, in Ion, primarily, that Christ was a symbol of the self. That was his consequence of decades of meditation on the structure of Christianity. Because it's the dying and resurrecting part of the psyche that remains constant across the transformation. So the ultimate order isn't to identify with this. That's your current state of being. And it isn't to identify with that because, well, you can't by definition. And it isn't even to identify with that. It's to let these things go as they need to go. That's a sacrifice. And to allow this continual process of transformation to occur. And part of that is the admission that you're wrong. And so partly what you're doing is, at micro levels and at macro levels, where are you not what you could be? And when you realize that, it'll take you apart a little bit and burn you down to your core a little bit, and then allow you to regenerate. And if you do that continually, then everything that you don't need burns away. Right? And that's what this means. You remember in Harry Potter, you may remember that Harry goes down, so in the second volume and in the second movie, Harry's at Hogwarts, so it's the school where you learn how to be magic, because that's what you really are. And there's something that threatens the school. Well, part of what threatens the school? Evil, right? Voldemort, that's one thing. But at the same time, it's also the snake that lurks underneath. It's the basilisk that threatens the school. And so the basilisk is the dragon, and when the basilisk looks at you, then you're paralyzed because you're a prey animal, and if a predator captures you in its gaze, you freeze. And the reason you freeze is because your body reacts to the predator as something that should turn you to stone. Sorry about that. So what do you do about the basilisk? Well, one thing you do is you run and hide. But the other thing you do is go confront it in its lair, and that's what Harry Potter does now. And what's interesting about him is he's also touched by evil, right? And that means that he's an embodiment of what Jung would regard as someone who's integrated the shadow. And without that capacity, he isn't able to communicate, say, with snakes. And that's not so good, because since there are snakes, it's not such a bad idea to know how to communicate with them. And he goes down into the underground, right, into the chaotic domain that's underneath the school in order to find the snake in its lair. Now, if I remember correctly, you tell me if I'm wrong, doesn't he go down through a bathroom? Through a toilet? Right, well, so that's an indication of the Jungian dictum that what you need most is to be found where you least want to look. I had a client once who actually had a dream like that. He dreamt that he had to go into the underground world through an outhouse. Right, it was very, very interesting, and it was an elaboration of precisely this theme. It's what you've thrown away as of little value to you, and maybe what you hate and hold in contempt and fear is exactly what you have to face if you want to go down to the place where the transformations occur. So what happens in Harry Potter? Well, this basilisk is wandering around, paralyzing everyone who isn't able to communicate with snakes. And he doesn't fight the basilisk precisely, he goes down into its lairs, the underground world. And that, what down there is that snake has got Ginevra, right? His girlfriend, that's her name, right? It's a variant of Virginia, that's a variant of virgin, and the snake always has a virgin. That's one of its characteristics, right? Like gold. He goes down there to rescue her. What happens to him? He gets bit, and he's going to die. So what happens? The phoenix comes along and cries tears into his wounds and cures him. And that's... So the idea is that what saves you in the encounter with the snake is your capacity to let things go and die and come back to life. Right. It's so interesting, that story's told in that way in that series of volumes, because the plot structure is perfect in a mythological sense. It's exactly right. And the phoenix actually happens to be the pet of the main wizard, which is also perfect. It's exactly right. So, you know, what's his name? Dumbledore. Yeah, he's basically, for all intents and purposes, God the Father. And his pet, his close ally, is the thing that can die and that transforms. Well, you can see the echoes of Christian thought in that, but that isn't exactly right. It's that Christian thought and the mythological substructure upon which the Harry Potter volume is based are drawing from the same underlying pool of ideas and symbols. And they're universally accessible. And you can tell that because if they weren't, that book wouldn't have sold. How many million copies? How many million copies did it sell? And the movies, it's unbelievably, overwhelmingly powerful. She got kids to read 600-page books, like multiple volumes lining up for them. You got to ask yourself why. Silly stories about magical orphans. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe people aren't so stupid. And certainly if they happen to be reading relatively complex books, attributing that to stupidity seems to be rather counterproductive. There's this thing that exists, this multi-headed snake, and it's got this infinity problem. It's everywhere. That's that little circle down there. And the problem is, well, what do you do with it? You cut off one head, 7 more grow. That's the eternal problem of life. And the problem is, there is the category of problems in life, and it ain't going anywhere. And so the question is, can you deal with the whole category at the same time? That's the thing. That's how to be in the world, is to deal with that category all at the same time. And so how did human beings, what did they come up with as a solution? And that's so cool too, because the solution they come up with not only was the heroism that allows you to approach what you're terrified by and what you find offensive and to learn from it, but also the idea of sacrifice. And that was played out by cultures everywhere, including human sacrifice. And you think, what the hell was up with those crazy bastards so long ago? They were sacrificing to gods all the time. What kind of clueless behavior was that? Burn something and please God. Burn something valuable and please God. It's like, what was with them? What were they thinking? Well, They weren't stupid, those people. If they were stupid, we wouldn't be here. They were not stupid, and believe me, they lived under a lot harsher conditions than we do. So those were some tough people, man. You know, back then you'd last about 15 minutes, and so you don't want to be thinking of your ancestors as stupid. Like, there's no real evidence that we're much different cognitively than we were 150,000 years ago. So anyways, sacrifice. What does that mean, sacrifice? Well, it's a discovery, man. It's the discovery of the future. It's like the future is actually the place where there is threat, and it's always going to be there. So what do? You make sacrifices in the present so that the future is better. Right. Everyone does that. That's what you're doing right now. That's what you're doing here. That's what your parents are doing when they pay money to send you to university. They think, you can bargain with reality. It's amazing. You can bargain with reality. You can forestall gratification now, and it'll pay off at a place and time that doesn't even exist yet. It's like, who would have believed that? It's like, that's a miracle that that occurs. And it's not like people just figured that out overnight. You know, we were chimps, for Christ's sake. Like, how are we going to come up with an idea like that? Well, it's like, well, we thought about it for 7 million years. And, you know, we got to the point where we could kind of act it out. But we didn't know what we were doing. But it was it emerged as like a dream. It was, so the terror of the future is a dream. And the solution to the terror, the dream of the terror of the future, is another dream. And it comes out in mythology and in fantasy and in drama, where you act out the sacrifice. And then it's a step on the way to full understanding. So we can say sacrifice now instead of doing it, you know, although we still do it. It's just not concretized like it used to be. We do it abstractly. And we all have faith that it will work, you know, and we also set up our societies so that it'll work. And one thing about, you know, I'm not a fan of moral relativism for a variety of reasons, partly because I think it's an extreme form of cowardice. But anyways, apart from that, no. There's minimal ways that you can set up a society that will work. And so one of them is that the society has to be set up so that your sacrifices will pay off, or you won't work, and then the society will die. And so it has to make promises. People have to make promises to one another. And that's what money is. Money is a promise that your sacrifice will pay off in the future. That's what money is. And so if the society is stable, you can store up your work right now, you can sacrifice your impulses, and you can work, and you can store up credit for the future, and then you can make the future a better place. But society has to be stable enough to allow for that. Hyperinflation will do you in. So the promise that's implicit in the currency is the promise that what you're doing now will pay off in the future. And if people don't have that promise, then, well, we know what they do. Because in gangs, for example, in, say, gangs in North America, the time horizon of the gang members shrinks rapidly because they don't really expect to be alive much past 21. And so they get really impulsive and violent, and like, why the hell not? That's what you do when the future doesn't matter, when it's not real. You default back to living in the moment, and you take what you can get right now. And no wonder, because you don't know if you're going to be around in a year. And you get whatever you can while you can bloody well get it. And that's like anarchy, that state. And so you don't want to live in, some people like to live in that state because they're really wired for that, you know. And so they're much more comfortable in those conditions. They're kind of like warrior types, I would say, in some sense. But, you know, for most people, that's just, well, that stress will just do you in, you know, the stress of a life like that. So people, even now, because it's like the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, are celebrating Lenin. It's like, that's not good. That's like celebrating Hitler. Okay, I'm dead serious about that. It's not good. And the fact that people can dare to think that that's okay means that there's something wrong with the way that we look at history. Lenin was a monster. And if you want to know about that, you can read Solzhenitsyn's writings about Lenin. Because the communist apologists say, well, it wasn't Lenin. Lenin was a good guy. He was all motivated by love of the working class. It's like, well, his henchman was Stalin. And if your henchman is Stalin, you're not a good guy. and Lenin was around during the early collectivization. And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he was perfectly willing to have any number of people die as long as his ideological system could be brought into being. So there's no celebrating Lenin. There's no we're cool, young, Marxist, hip revolutionaries, and he's our idol. It's like, there's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent. Well, there was the death of the kulaks, I told you about that. There was the Ukrainian famine, that's 6 million gone there. There was the rise of the Gulag state because it turned out that Russia, the Soviet Union, couldn't run on the principles that it had laid down as sacrosanct. They just didn't work, so you had to enslave everybody and run your economy as a slave state, essentially. And try not to kill the people in the gulags so fast that you can't suck some productive labor out of them. There's the death of tens of millions of people. We don't even know. The estimates range from 15 to 60 million. And like, we won't get too picayune about the numbers because after the first 10 million, you kind of made your point. And the fact that we don't know between 15 and 60 is actually an indication of the horror of it. Because our count is off by tens of millions. And that's only within the last century. And then there was the 1956 crackdown on Hungary and the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. Then there was the whole like thermonuclear Holocaust thing that was going on at the same time, and the fact that in 1962 and in 1984 we were seconds away from complete annihilation, right? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the keys were in the intercontinental ballistic missile release systems, and Castro, as he admitted to Jimmy Carter, in case any of you are Castro fans, which you shouldn't be, that he was perfectly willing to have Cuba annihilated if it would have meant the defeat of the United States. And then in 1984, approximately, I may have the date exactly wrong, the Russians received an indication from their early warning systems that the Americans had launched 5 thermonuclear missiles, and one Russian decided that it was a mistake and refused to launch the retaliation. And he just died about 2 weeks ago. So, you know, that was pretty close. And so that was experiment number 1, let's say. That wasn't good, that experiment. Let's put it that way. It wasn't good. It was exactly the antithesis of good. It was precisely the antithesis of good. But that wasn't all. I mean, there's the People's Republic of China. That's a different country. Like, seriously, a different country, right? Different tradition, different language. How many people died in China under Mao? No one knows. Same issue with the Soviet Union, although Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive, you know, because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the 3, Mao was probably the worst. He's still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnants of that horrible state. Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward. Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, you know, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, etc., etc., etc. It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically... the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count. So then the first question was, well, are these Marxists motivated by love or hatred? Well, is it love or hatred that produces 100 million dead people? And is that enough evidence or not? And if it's not enough evidence, if you think to yourself, well, that's not enough evidence, it was never really given its proper try. It's like, well, what would have been a proper try? See, I always think when I hear someone say that, I know what you think. You think in your delusional arrogance that you understand the Marxist doctrines better than anyone else ever has, and that if you were the one implementing those doctrines, you would have ushered in the utopia. That's what you mean when you say that. And you know, they say, and there's an idea in the New Testament that there's a sin, it's the sin against the Holy Ghost. If you commit that sin, no one really knows what it is, that you can't be forgiven. And I would say, well, if you want a candidate for the sin against the Holy Ghost in the 21st century, the statement, real communism was never tried, with the underlying idea that if you had been the person implementing it, it would have worked, I think that's a pretty good contender for something for which you should never be forgiven.